Hello, everybody. Welcome to class. I'm always enchanted by people who are inquisitive, who have intellectual curiosity, who want to find and grow in their awareness of their place in the universe, and how we support one another. So, I'm going to talk to you today about one James Foreman, who James Foreman was the late James Foreman was a nonviolent freedom fighter in the United States. He was an influential leader and has a record for being a bold truth teller. But before we get to him, I'd first like to read a relevant passage from John's Gospel. A passage that makes me think of people like James Foreman. And then I'll give you a little bit of my personal background, then get to Foreman. So here we go with John chapter 7. After this, Jesus traveled around Galilee. He wanted to stay out of Judea, where the Jewish leaders were plotting his death. But soon it was time for the Jewish festival of shelters. And Jesus's brothers said to him, "Leave here and go to Judea, where your followers can see your miracles. You can't become famous if you hide like this. If you can do such wonderful things, show yourself to the world." For even his brothers didn't believe in him. Jesus replied, "Now is not the right time for me to go, but you can go anytime. The world can't hate you, but it does hate me because I accuse it of doing evil." That last part again. The world can't hate you, but it does hate me because I accuse it of doing evil. I was born into Christianity. Like many people in the West. And although I was born into Christianity, the historic Black church developed quite differently from the panoply of denominations and traditions that help comprise American civil religion, which broadly includes assimilated American Jews, Hispanic Christians, Asian American and Pacific Islander Christians, and many Black congregations. The Christian Black, Indigenous, and people of color, known as BIPOC, these populations can often be recognized by their political timidity and aspiration for saintliness. The constructive characteristic of these qualities is that they try not to make trouble for others. The questionable aspect is that they also try not to make good trouble, as coined by the late Congressman John Lewis. My orientation to Christianity, even within the Black churches our family attended, maintained at the same time both the liberationist nature of Black Christianity, and not without conflict, also elements of American civil religion. I was devoted to the faith more passionately as a college student and young adult than most of my peers. As time passed, I began to question the whiteness of our Black faith. I later understood the whiteness as Christian West supremacy, which is the dominant form of the religion, not only in the West, but wherever the West has ruled throughout the world. I began to question and research Western Christianity while simultaneously attending seminary, which, like most seminaries in our country, was an exponent of Western Christianity. My curiosity would not allow me to settle for that kind of education. My ongoing and growing respect for Jesus was enough to keep me from turning to another faith tradition or none at all. My quest did leave me with a greater appreciation for other ways of thinking, whether the world's major religions, ancient indigenous practices, agnostics, or atheists. I have come away with more questions and less judgment. These discoveries help explain how I have fallen head over heels in love with creation and all her peoples. I am grateful to all the beings that endorsed and helped me to stand and to move forward, to brace me during this continuing adventure. I also appreciate those who pushed back until they changed and came alive as I did, and also those who are still pushing back and appear determined not to change. So in summary, I'd like to repeat something that I've done very frequently. I apologize to the dear ones whom I pushed against, and I celebrate being in a state of love for you all, for everybody. So James Foreman is known for an address that he gave at Riverside Church. Well, let me tell you about Riverside Church, a prodigious old congregation or church in New York City. Stands apart from many churches. It's known as something of a bastion for progressive thought. Their motto is, and I quote, "We are an interdenominational, interracial, international, open, welcoming, and affirming church and congregation." Riverside Church, the Reverend Jesse Jackson gave the eulogy at Jackie Robinson's funeral service in 1972. Jackie Robinson, of course, is the first Black person to play in major leagues baseball. At Riverside Church in 1991, Nelson Mandela, the anti-apartheid activist and later South African president, spoke at Riverside following his release from prison. Secretary General of the United Nations, Kofi Annan, spoke there after the September 11th, 2001 attacks. Speakers at Riverside Church have also included theologians Paul Tillich, Reinhold Niebuhr, Cesar Chavez, Desmond Tutu, Fidel Castro, the 14th Dalai Lama, and Abdullah II of Jordan. And perhaps most prominent of all, what the church may be known for more than anything, is on April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a speech called Beyond Vietnam, a time to break silence, in which he voiced his opposition to the Vietnam War, a very unpopular position. And this was at Riverside Church. And it's not likely coincidental that 1 year to the day, April 4th, 1968, when Dr. King was murdered. But then a year after that, 2 years after Dr. King's address, James Foreman, who wasn't invited to speak, he interrupted a sermon at Riverside Church, saying it was an example of several churches and synagogues from which Black Americans could ask for reparations for slavery. Before Foreman could begin to explain the reason for interrupting, the organist drowned out his words with the hymn, "May Jesus Christ be Praised." Foreman, the former executive secretary of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, was one of the key leaders of the 1964 Freedom Summer, a project to register as many Black voters in Mississippi as possible, as well as the 1965 Selma to Montgomery marches, infamously put down with billy clubs and tear gas on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, now known as Bloody Sunday. The Black Manifesto is regarded to be the first systematic, fully elaborated plan for reparations to emerge from the Black freedom movement. Foreman spoke up about Riverside's relationship with John D. Rockefeller Jr., charging that Rockefeller used, quote, money stolen from the poor to build this great cathedral, and whose money is still exploiting people of color all around the world. He demanded a list of the church's assets, and I'll say something about how that worked out in a moment. James Foreman called for reparations of $500 million at the rate of $15 per Black person. Foreman was specific in his demands, calling for funding of a Southern land bank, 4 publishing houses and television networks to generate jobs and capital, as well as to counter racist media representations, a research institute, a training center, both welfare and labor organizing, an international Black appeal to do fundraising and anti-defamation work, and a Black university. He later raised the demand from $500 million to $3 billion. So I want you to listen to the preamble of the Black Manifesto, which was developed by activists in Detroit. We, the Black people assembled in Detroit, Michigan for the National Black Economic Development Conference, are fully aware that we have been forced to come together because racist white America has exploited our resources, our minds, our bodies, our labor. For centuries, we have been forced to live as colonized people inside the United States, victimized by the most vicious racist system in the world. We have helped to build the most industrial country in the world. And here are James Foreman's closing words. I skipped to the end. All roads must lead to revolution. Unite with whomever you can unite, neutralize wherever possible, fight our enemies relentlessly, victory to the people, life and good health to mankind, resistance to domination by the white Christian churches and the Jewish synagogues, revolutionary Black power, we shall win without a doubt. So this is where that passage in John really comes to the fore in my consciousness, where Jesus says, the world can't hate you because I accuse it of doing evil, it hates me. James Foreman accused the world system of doing evil. James Foreman shocked. He disrupted. I will say more about disruption in a moment and how important it is right now. But let's learn from Jesus this really important lesson. Have the courage, when necessary, to not live up to your family's expectations. Remember, his own brothers were trying to put him in his place. Your family may be the people who, when you step forward, try to pull you back, to put you in your place. And I'm urging you to disrupt. Disruption can be good for multiple parties. African Americans routinely talk about our ancestors who were held captive. And you don't hear our white sisters and brothers talking about their ancestors as slaveholders nearly as much, or beneficiaries of unpaid labor, of stolen land from indigenous people. Sort of how familiar we all are with support groups for survivors of sex abuse. What we don't see is support groups for sexual perpetrators. The history of slavery in the United States is taught as Black history. I'll say that again. The history of slavery in the US is taught as Black history, when in fact it should be taught as American history. Now to reparations. Reparations are fundamentally about two things, as James Foreman saw it. Number one, it's about revealing secrets. In 1970, the Riverside Church released its financial figures for the first time. After Foreman remonstrated for quite some time, The figures valued the building at 86 million and the total financial endowment at 18 million, as well as the creation of, by that point, of a $450,000 fund for social justice to disburse reparations over 3 years. The second thing that reparations are about is they're about healing humanity. Following a 1972 Metropolitan Mission Study, several ministries aimed toward ameliorating social conditions in the New York City area were formed at Riverside Church. The pastor at that time, Reverend Campbell, his tenure was marked by several controversial sermons and increasing conflicts among the church's boards and councils and staff. So in June 1976, Reverend Campbell suddenly resigned, having felt his style of leadership was not sufficient to reconcile these disagreements. This is the kind of disruption, like ripples, that keeps, what James Foreman did, affected that church for years, but it was really on a small scale when you think about what remains to be done. I've talked to you about how Christianity was perverted to accommodate whites, but before I stop, I need to note some of the ways it affected Africans. Africans in America. Africans were the target of conversion. In the south of the country, Africans were not granted access to the church building, but elsewhere, wherever they lived, they were required to attend white churches. They were usually seated in the back or in the balcony. And this is just one way that white Christians reminded them of their place, and they used Christianity for the purpose of domination. Still, Africans tended to look forward to Sundays at those churches because it was one of the rare times that they could see friends or even family. In some cases, Africans willingly converted because they were constantly gaslighted. Enslaved Africans were often given the privilege to learn to read, which was really appealing. It was the Bible, of course, but literacy was important to them. And it was commonly reported among whites that a Christian slave would be, quote, a better slave. We all want our dignity. We all want others to respect us, possibly even like us. And if you are living your best life, you will be controversial at some point. A little bit farther in the chapter that I read in John chapter 7, it says in verse 12, among the crowds, there was widespread whispering about Jesus. Some said, he is a good man. Others replied, no, he deceives the people. But no one would say anything publicly about him for fear of the leaders. That's the kind of pressure. I don't think Jesus at all had a death wish. But he knew that the course he had taken, the course of justice, the course of buttressing the hopes of the poor, he knew that that was a confrontational course to take and that it could end in death. I have a request to make of each of you. You, my sisters and brothers, please prepare your hearts for conflict. The only way I think that you can, or at least the best way I think you can do that, is through stillness. The strongest empowerment you'll find is your breath. It's not a coincidence that the same words translated in our Bible for spirit are the same words for breath. Prepare your hearts for conflict. there's no such thing as peace of mind. We use the term, but the mind is always agitated. You have to go deeper than the mind. You have to go deeper than your mind in order to find a place of peace, so that you can live with yourself, live with your life. So I urge you to please prepare your hearts for conflict. I'm counting on you. So many people are counting on you to disrupt. If you are white, please ask yourself, what if the price you pay for disrupting is directly related to necessary reparations? And to every white person listening now, we're not thinking about putting you through what we've gone through, what our ancestors went through. We're not looking for payback. We're looking for restorative justice. It's necessary for both the victim and the offender to make things right, because you can't name a figure. The amount of money doesn't exist that would be satisfactory compensation, just compensation for indigenous peoples and Africans in America, both North America and South America. There's a woman by the name of April Rain. She's a media strategist and an advocate for diversity and inclusion. And she's known for creating, about 6 years ago, she created the movement with the hashtag Oscars So White. In fact, she's credited with starting the hashtag that changed the Oscars. And I bring that up now because I reflect upon that from time to time. I talk about it. Maybe you've heard me talk about it. I wasn't as bothered, even though the Academy changed their ways and they brought in some members of color as part of their voting body. There's so much that we can be troubled by. Silicon Valley so white, journalism so white, university professorship so white, tenure so very white, Wall Street so white, the United States Senate so white, the Republican Party so white. I mean, we could go on and on. Madison Avenue. These things are so white, and there's a need for disruption. But there's one that I think is most troubling, and that is church so white. Because church is where offenders throughout our history on these shores have gone to quiet their consciences, to feel justified, to get this idea. It's a scriptural idea, but it's misappropriated, being justified by faith. So they talk about their faith. They practice their faith by participating in churches that are the opposite of disruptors. They keep blessing genocide by their very existence. They keep blessing enslavement, exclusion of the poor, segregation, or American apartheid. They bless these things by not addressing them, or addressing them in a way that makes everybody feel good because at least we talked about it, with no call to action, with no sense of brokenness that leads to change, that leads to reparations. So I urge you to please, by all means, by any means necessary, to consider the place of the church these centuries. There were churches in the United States that celebrated their slaveholders, and not just in the South. There are churches that were built by slaves, and the materials were paid for by the slave trade. These are churches that really have no justifiable existence. They benefited, at least economically, some people. They benefited the slaveholding class, the elites, even the whites that weren't slave traders or slave holders, because they created a mood in society that this is normal, that this is the way to be. Exploiting people, dehumanizing people, killing people, raping, especially our women. And so there are questions to be raised about, should the churches exist, especially if they do not pay reparations. So here's the upside of all of this, because if those churches lead the charge, well, churches don't typically lead the charge on matters of justice. Usually they are opposing justice and co-signing to the status quo. But if those churches would lead the way and model reparations, perhaps we would see generosity, if you will, justice on the part of corporations, multinationals, governments. Maybe all of those places that I mentioned before that are so white would recognize that their exclusivity is unjust, historically unjust, and it's been seen as normal. It's not normal. It's not humane, and it is definitely not Christian. Well, thank you for taking the time to listen, and I want to if you would consider a couple of questions. I would like for you to think about, because I myself am a recovering colonized mind. I would like for you to think about what the apologies that I have had to make for resisting reality because of my colonized mind. And I would like for you to also consider how it is, when sometimes a person can have amnesia from trauma. And then as time passes, the effects of that trauma can wear off and they can start remembering what happened in the past. Well, we as Africans in America have been severely traumatized, dehumanized, humiliated, deprived, impoverished. But it's not just Africans in America, it's indigenous people. For us, it's Mexicans, Latin Americans. And I should include women, even women who are not women of color. I definitely need to include queer folk. I need to talk about people who are warehoused en masse in prisons. there's been something of an amnesia through this trauma, and we've accepted so much that was unjust. But there's this collective recovering of memory of what happened to us when we were traumatized. And therefore, you see this resistance to colonization throughout the Americas and many places around the world. Everywhere from Australasia to French Polynesia. I'm more aware of the activity in the state of Hawaii. There's this recovery of memory happening. It's in our bones. We inherited it from our ancestors, but it's not just our ancestors. I was having a conversation with my daughter at the time she was living in Japan, and we were texting each other back and forth. And I was having this conversation, and we were trying to determine if things were better. And she didn't think so. And I said, well, at least, Charity, you didn't have to see a charred corpse hanging from a tree like your grandfather, my dad. And she replied, yes, but I saw live streamed on Facebook, Philando Castile get shot by a police officer. And there's so many other examples. So this trauma doesn't have the grip that it once had. So we are less compliant, if you will. And we're recovering from Christianity, Western Christianity, the supremacy of the Christian West. We're recovering from that. We're waking up. We're not going to go back to sleep, or we're not going to allow the loss of memory to dominate our being any longer. But we need allies. We're not waiting for someone to lead us, but we do need allies. We need people of conscience to come alongside, because numbers matter eventually. Eventually. I remind you of the passage where Jesus' own brothers would not support him. They wanted to put him in his place, and it's just the way it works. Humanity kills its best. Killed its best at Calvary, and it's been killing its best over and over again. In spite of the danger, in spite of the possibility for being insulted, or worse, I am urging you, please be a disruptor, because this is not normal. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew.